Welcome back to TalesBlip, and today's story is The Baker's Secret. Hi, I'm Nyoka, and I'm 25. I'm a baker, and I own a bakery called Reverie in Giverny. It's a small town, tucked away in the heart of the French countryside. It's the kind of place where time seems to stand still, where the pace of life is slow and gentle. It's a place where everyone knows everyone, where secrets are shared in hushed whispers over cups of coffee at the local cafe. Everyone says I look like I stepped out of a fairy tale. I have long, golden curls that reach my waist and bright blue eyes. And I have to admit, there's a certain charm to Giverny, a certain magic in the air. It's the kind of place where you can't help but feel a sense of wonder. A sense of possibility. But there's a dark secret in Giverny, a secret that no one knows except me. You see, I'm not just a baker. I'm also the keeper of a very old secret. It's a secret that has been passed down through generations of bakers, a secret that has been whispered in the shadows of the town's bakeries for centuries. It's a secret that I never wanted to be a part of. But it's a secret that has now become a part of me, a secret that has woven itself into the fabric of my being. And it all started with my grandmother. My grandmother was a baker, too. Her bakery was a small, cozy shop tucked away in the corner of a bustling marketplace. It was a place where the aroma of freshly baked bread and cinnamon filled the air. Where the sound of laughter and chatter filled the air, and where the warmth of the oven made you feel welcome and loved. She taught me everything I know about baking. She taught me how to make pastries that would melt in your mouth, cakes that were as light as air, and breads that were so delicious you'd eat them all in one sitting. She was a master baker, and I was her eager student. She also taught me how to make a mean pot pie. Her secret recipe was passed down through generations. It was a labor of love, a recipe that had been passed down from her own grandmother. She called it a baker's secret, a recipe that only a few select people had the honor of tasting. I was one of them, and I learned it so well that I eventually added it to the menu at Reverie. It was my grandmother's way of teaching me that there was more to baking than just following a recipe. It was about feeling the food, about understanding the ingredients, about knowing what each ingredient brings to the table. And it was also about knowing your customers. She told me that baking was about more than just making food. It was about making people feel good. It was about creating a sense of community, a sense of belonging. It was about bringing people together, sharing stories, and making memories. It was about making the world a little bit brighter, a little bit sweeter, a little bit more delicious. When I decided to open my own bakery in Giverny, I knew I wanted to create a space that would feel as warm and inviting as my grandmother's. I knew I wanted to bake things that would make people feel happy. But I also knew that there was a lot more to baking than just creating the perfect pastry. I wanted to create a space where people could feel seen, heard, and understood. A place where they could share their stories, their joys, their sorrows. A place where they could feel a sense of community. And I did. Reverie quickly became a beloved spot in Giverny, a place where locals and visitors alike could gather for a cup of coffee and a sweet treat. It was a place where people could escape the hustle and bustle of everyday life and find a moment of peace and tranquility. I loved my bakery. I loved my customers. I loved the feeling of creating something beautiful and delicious. It was a good life. Until it wasn't. It all started with the whispers. It started slowly, subtly, a shift in the energy of the town, but it was definitely there. The whispers started in the shadows, in the corners of cafes and bistros, in hushed tones over cups of coffee. The baker at the town's oldest bakery, La Petite Boulangerie, had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a trail of mystery and unanswered questions. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only a few boxes of unsold bread and an empty chair in the corner of the bakery. The whispers turned into rumors, rumors that spread like wildfire through the town. It was a local legend, something that people whispered about over cups of coffee at the local cafe and over bowls of soup at the town's small pub. At first, I dismissed the rumors as nothing more than gossip. I was a baker, not a witch. But something about the unsettling atmosphere in the town, a sense of unease that had settled over Giverny, began to creep under my skin. I couldn't help but feel a sense of anxiety, of impending doom. I tried to ignore it, to focus on my baking, to create a space where people could feel safe and happy. but it was impossible. The feeling of unease was a dark cloud that hung over everything. It made it hard to focus, to concentrate on my work. And it was slowly starting to eat away at me. One rainy afternoon, as I walked home from the market, my arms laden with groceries, the feeling of unease intensified. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind was whipping around me, making it difficult to keep my balance. My groceries felt heavy in my arms, and I was already starting to feel the first signs of a headache coming on. As I rounded the corner, I saw a figure standing in the doorway of my bakery. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes. He was holding an umbrella and was looking at me with a curious intensity. "Nyoka," he said, his voice a deep baritone. "Need some help?" "Thank you, Berard," I said, my voice soft, almost a whisper. "That would be so kind." Berard smiled, a charming smile that I knew could disarm even the most wary of souls. But it was a smile that I found unsettling, a smile that seemed to mask something dark and dangerous. He took one of my bags, his hand brushing against mine, sending a shiver down my spine. I couldn't help but feel a sense of uneasiness. "I'm new in town," Berard said, his voice smooth and charming. "Just moved here from the city. I thought I might try out your bakery. Welcome to Giverny," I said, forcing a smile. "You'll love it here." "It's a beautiful town, yes, I'm sure I will," Berard said, his smile widening. As we walked toward my bakery, Berard chatted about the city, about his life, and about the beauty of Giverny. He was charming, engaging, and utterly disarming. He was the kind of man who could make you feel like you were the only person in the room, the kind of man who could make you feel like you had known him your whole life. But there was something about him, a shadow in his eyes, a tension in his voice, that made me uneasy. He was too perfect, too charming. As we reached my bakery, I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking slightly. It was as if I was suddenly aware of how vulnerable I was, how exposed I felt. Berard took the umbrella from me and held it over my head as I opened the door to my bakery. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You're welcome," Berard said, his smile widening. He followed me inside, and I shut the door behind us, feeling a sense of relief. The interior of Reverie was lit by soft yellow lamps, creating a warm and inviting atmosphere. The scent of freshly baked bread and cinnamon filled the air, creating a sense of comfort and nostalgia. I placed the groceries on the counter and turned to thank Berard again. "I really appreciate you helping me, Berard," I said, my voice a little shaky. But he was gone. I looked around the bakery, but he was nowhere to be seen. The door was closed, and I couldn't imagine how he could have escaped without me noticing. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt a sudden surge of panic. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. I was alone. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself down. I told myself it was just my imagination, that Berard was probably just outside, waiting for me to finish putting the groceries away. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to focus on my baking, on the warm, inviting aroma that filled my bakery. I told myself that everything was fine, that it was all in my head. But it was no use. I couldn't ignore the sense of impending doom that was creeping into my bones. It was then I heard a soft scratching noise coming from behind me. I turned and saw a shadow cast against the wall, a long, dark, sinuous shadow that seemed to slither and coil. It was then I realized that Berard was not just a stranger, not just a new resident of Giverny, but something more, something dangerous, and he was coming for me. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest, and ran. I ran to the back door, and I slammed it open, rushing outside into the pouring rain. But he was already there, standing in the shadows, his eyes burning with an unholy intensity. "You can't escape me." "Nyoka," he said, his voice a cold, menacing whisper. "You're mine now." I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran as fast as I could, but he was faster. He was closing in on me, his long, dark shadow looming over me, consuming my world. I ran, but it was no use. He was gaining on me. I tried to call out for help, to scream, but my voice was lost in the roar of the wind and the deluge of rain. He was almost upon me. I tripped and fell, landing in a puddle of mud. I tried to get up, but I was too weak, too exhausted. His shadow engulfed me. And then I felt his hand on my throat, his fingers digging into my flesh. "You're going to pay for what you've done," Berard said, his voice a guttural growl. His teeth, now sharp and pointed, sank into my skin. I felt my body go numb, and my vision started to fade. I tried to fight back, to scream, to claw at his face, but it was no use. He was too strong, too powerful. And then I heard his voice, low and menacing, whispering in my ear. "You're mine now, Nyoka. You're going to be my secret." I felt his strength constricting my throat, cutting off my air. I saw the world around me begin to fade, the shadows and the light blurring together. And then I blacked out. When I woke up, I was in a dark, cramped room. I was bound, my wrists and ankles tightly tied together, and I felt a dull ache in my head. I couldn't remember what had happened. I couldn't remember how I got here. Then I remembered the pain, the burning sensation in my throat, the feeling of my life being squeezed away. I was terrified. I struggled against my bonds, but they were too strong. I was trapped. The room was small and cold, with only a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. I could see dust motes dancing in the air, illuminated by the feeble light. I could hear the faint sound of voices coming from the other side of the door. The voices were muffled and distant, but I could make out the sound of laughter and chatter. I strained to listen, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Then I heard a name that sent a shiver down my spine. "Nyoka," a voice said. "The baker's secret." I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I knew that voice. It was Berard. He was the one who had taken me. He was the one who had brought me here. And he was the one who was going to kill me. I couldn't let him do that. I had to escape, but how? I looked around the room, desperately searching for a way out. There was a small window in the wall, but it was barred shut. The door was locked. There was nothing. I slumped down on the floor, feeling a wave of despair wash over me. I was trapped. I was going to die here, but I wasn't going to give up. I had to fight back. I thought back to what my grandmother had taught me about baking. She had told me that baking was about more than just following a recipe. It was about feeling the food, about understanding the ingredients, about knowing what each ingredient brings to the table. And it was also about knowing your customers. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I imagined the warmth of my oven, the aroma of freshly baked bread. I imagined the taste of my grandmother's secret pot pie. And then I remembered the bone saw. It was in my bakery, in a drawer in the back room. I had used it to make a special cut for my pies, a cut that made the pastry extra flaky and delicious. But I also knew that it was a dangerous tool, a tool that could be used to harm. I had a plan. I struggled to break free from my bonds, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew that I didn't have much time. The laughter and chatter from the other side of the door were growing louder. After what seemed like an eternity, I managed to break free from my bonds. My hands and ankles were raw and bleeding. But I was free. I stood up and limped towards the door. I knew that I couldn't break through it. It was too strong. But I had another plan. I crept to the window, and I began to work on the bars. I used my teeth and my fingernails, scraping at the metal until I could feel it give. It was slow, agonizing work. I was exhausted, my hands bleeding, but I kept at it. Finally, after what felt like hours, I managed to break one of the bars. The window was still too small to climb through, but it was enough. It was enough to give me hope. I pressed my body against the window, squeezing my way through the bars. I felt a sharp pain as my skin scraped against the rough metal, but I didn't care. I was free. I scrambled out the window, my feet landing on the soft earth. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, letting the cool night air wash over me. I was free. I was alive, but I wasn't safe yet. I had to find a way to get back to my bakery, to get back to my oven, to get back to my bone saw. I knew that Berard would be looking for me. He wouldn't let me escape, but I was determined to survive. I started to run. I ran through the darkness, my feet pounding on the soft earth. I ran until I felt my lungs burning, until my legs felt like lead. But I kept running. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew that I had to get away from Burrard. The rain was pouring down, and the wind was howling, but I didn't care. I just kept running. And then I saw it. A light in the distance. It was my bakery, Reverie. It was home. I broke into a run, my heart pounding in my chest. I burst through the door, and I slammed it shut behind me. I was home. I looked around the bakery, my eyes scanning the room. It was dark, and I could hear the faint sound of the rain beating against the windows. But I didn't care. I was safe. I ran to the back room and pulled open the drawer. There it was. The bone saw, my heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I was going to survive. I was going to fight back. I gripped the bone saw, and I felt a sense of power surge through me. I was a baker, but I was also something else. I was a survivor. I was a warrior. And Burrard was going to pay. I stood there for a moment, taking a deep breath, feeling the power of the bone saw in my hands. I could feel the weight of the metal, the sharpness of the blade. I could feel the darkness within it, a darkness that mirrored my own. I knew what I had to do. I had to find Burrard. I had to confront him. I had to make him pay for what he had done to me. I grabbed a flashlight from the back room, and I turned it on, the beam piercing the darkness. Then I stepped outside, the cold night air washing over me. I had to be careful. I had to be stealthy. I had to make sure that Burrard didn't see me coming. The rain had stopped, but the wind was still howling, whipping through the trees and tearing at the leaves. I could see the outline of the buildings in the distance, the houses and shops of Giverny, illuminated by the flickering lights of the street lamps. I walked through the town, my footsteps echoing in the silence of the night. I walked slowly, carefully, my eyes scanning the shadows, looking for any sign of Burrard. But he was nowhere to be seen. I walked for what felt like hours, but I couldn't find any trace of him. I was starting to lose hope. I stopped by the river, letting the cool air wash over my face. The water was flowing quickly, the current strong and powerful. It was a beautiful sight, but it was also a dangerous one. The river could easily sweep you away, pulling you under its dark, cold waters. It was then I heard a sound. A low, guttural growl. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from the shadows, from the edge of the forest. I gripped the bone saw tighter. I was ready. I stepped into the shadows, the darkness surrounding me like a shroud. I walked slowly, carefully, my eyes scanning the trees, looking for any sign of movement. Then I saw him. Burrard was standing in the shadows, his eyes burning with a cold, unholy intensity. He was holding a long, sharp knife, its blade gleaming in the moonlight. "Nyoka," he said, his voice a low growl. "You thought you could escape me?" I stood my ground, my heart pounding in my chest. I was afraid, but I was also angry. "I'm not afraid of you, Burrard," I said. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." "You should be," Burrard said, his smile widening. "You should be very afraid." He lunged at me, the knife flashing in the darkness. I raised the bone saw to meet his attack. The two weapons collided, the sound ringing through the night. I felt the shock of the impact, the power of the blow. And then I felt the pain. The knife had cut my arm, slicing through my flesh and drawing blood. I cried out in pain, but I didn't falter. I kept fighting. I swung the bone saw, the blade slicing through the air, whistling in the night. It caught Burrard on the shoulder, and I heard him cry out in pain. He stumbled back, but he didn't fall. He lunged at me again, and I parried his attack. The bone saw clashing against his knife. I felt his strength, his power. But I was stronger. I was more determined. I swung the bone saw again, and this time I hit him in the chest. He cried out in pain, and he fell to the ground, the knife clattering to the forest floor. I stood over him, my heart pounding in my chest. I was trembling, but I wasn't afraid. I had won. "I told you I wasn't afraid of you anymore," I said. "I told you I wasn't afraid of you anymore." Burrard lay on the ground, his face pale and contorted in pain. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with fear. "What are you going to do to me?" he asked, his voice a mere whisper. I raised the bone saw above my head. The blade gleaming in the moonlight, I'm going to make you pay for what you've done to me, I said. I'm going to make you pay for what you've done to the other bakers. I'm going to make you pay for what you've done to this town. Berard screamed as I brought the bone saw down. I was not just a baker anymore. I was a protector. I was a warrior. I was a force to be reckoned with, and Giverny would be safe.